Good afternoon. I want very much to thank my colleague Leti Volpp for doing this talk on immigration law and COVID-19. Just do a very short introduction. Leti is the Robert D. and Leslie K. Raven Professor of Law and Access to Justice. She also directs the Campus Center for Race and Gender. She's an undergraduate degree from Princeton, master's from Harvard, Edinburgh, and a JD from Columbia Law School. She had extensive practice as a civil rights lawyer and joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 2005 and is nationally recognized as one of the leading experts in immigration law. With that, Leti, I'll turn it over to you, again, with enormous thanks for doing this presentation.
Thank you so much, Erwin. I'm really happy to be here. Can you all hear me? Okay, awesome. Let me also say, I just glanced who was in the meeting already, and there's so many other people who are actually in this webinar who are experts in immigration law. So I hope you all chime in. I want to try to talk us through a number of different aspects of what's been going on. And this is a time-limited presentation, so we'll see if we get to all of this. But I wanted to start by talking about xenophobia and hate crimes, which forms the broader context for what's been going on. Then I wanted to talk about borders and travel restrictions, refugee access, enforcement, detention, deportation, naturalization delays, access to COVID-19 support funds, and then anticipated future changes. So this pandemic has really dramatically impacted immigration and immigrants, both in the US and globally. It's disrupted virtually every aspect of the US immigration system. Starting with the question of xenophobia. The perception that specific persons are to blame for the virus has been fueled by President Donald Trump. On March 11th, in a rare Oval Office address to the nation, he referred to the coronavirus as a foreign virus. That week, he also shared a tweet that promoted a US southern border wall as a way to protect Americans from the, quote, China virus. And he subsequently began referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. Public health officials counsel us best practice is to avoid names that might result in discriminatory behavior against geographic places or particular groups, following guidelines of the World Health Organization, because of the unintended negative impacts of stigmatizing certain communities. After Trump called COVID-19 the Chinese virus in March, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council said that more than 650 incidents of discrimination directed against Asian Americans were reported to their website in 1 week alone. When criticized for the term, Trump claimed that it was, quote, not racist at all, and, quote, it comes from China, that's why. But it is all too clear that the negative impact his rhetoric is invoking is not unintended. Instead, it is a deliberate attempt to use racism to deflect attention from his administration's failings. It fuels a narrative of fear of and hatred for Chinese people, spurred by the perception of them as disease bearers and leading to the necessary step of keeping them out. Okay, so if you guys can hear this, wave your hand.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Secretary Azar says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
I think there's a great deal of misplaced fear directed at the Asian community.
In this situation, sometimes it's easy to move into perspectives in which there tends to be discrimination, there tends to be violation of human rights, there tends to be stigma on innocent people.
The moment really shifted the way I think about the larger Asian American community and this idea that we have to stand up for each other.
Calling this.
So the COVID-19 pandemic has thus been accompanied by a new term, the COVID-19 hate crime, requiring PSAs and resolutions being issued in condemnation. These hate crimes are starkly reminiscent of what happened after September 11th, with an epidemic of hate violence directed against those who appear Arab, Muslim, or Middle Eastern. So we see a very similar dynamic where the public was informed who was the enemy, who was responsible for the suffering through the actions of the government. In addition to being informed by Trump's choice of rhetoric, the public has been informed by government policy. As Trump put it, quote, "We closed it down to China, the source, very, very early, far earlier than even the great professionals wanted to do. And I think in the end, that will have saved a tremendous number of lives," close quote. The COVID-19 hate crimes are many, and this is just a tiny snapshot. In the space of less than 2 months, nearly 2,000 incidents were reported to stop AAPI hate. The poet and essayist Kathy Park Hong, writing in the New York Times, a piece called "The Slur I Never Expected to Hear in 2020, notes that coronavirus has brought a different strain of anti-Asian racism that she had been used to. Rather than being invisible or being seen as an efficient cyborg, she is now a quote unquote chink. As she writes, "Racism never disappears, but adapts to new circumstances when old strains rise from the dark vaults of American history. Here they invoke Chinatown as foul and disgusting, and Chinese as the enemy who will be subject to violent assault." 2 books that I would recommend by historians to help explain this older strain of racism: Beth Lou Williams on violence and exclusion, and Nyan Shah on Chinatown epidemics and race. So like a virus, racism mutates and adapts. So let me just show you a short clip from Trump's rally just 2 days ago. This is in Tulsa, and let me share. Oops. And once again, if you could wait, oops, I can't see any of you guys. If you could wave at me if you can see this, that would be, or if you can hear
this. By the
this.
way, it's a disease, without question, has more names than any disease in history. I can name Kung Flu. I can name 19 different versions of names.
Okay. So let me now go back to my PowerPoint. And I apologize, I can't see any of you anymore. Let me see if I can find you on Zoom.
Leti, I'm here if you need help with anything.
Yeah, I just, as I told Whitney, I wasn't teaching this semester, so I am a total newbie. Okay, here you guys are. Let me put this here. I can see you guys again, and then go back to my share screen. Great. Okay, so we have also, just yesterday, Peter Navarro, speaking to a reporter, basically suggesting that COVID-19 was created as a deliberate ploy, right? That China created the virus. They, quote, "sent over hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens here to spread that around and around the world. Whether they did it on purpose, it's an open question. They're guilty until proven innocent." So something I want to point to is this real through line to language in the very first Supreme Court opinion setting out the framework for federal immigration law, approving congressional power to exclude and giving the political branches of government the primary power over immigration law, with vast hordes of foreigners of a different race who will not assimilate with us. This long through line is also an extended history of blaming groups for disease. Jews were blamed for causing the plague in Europe. In response, were killed, buried alive, burned to death. Cholera in the 1830s in New York was called the Irish disease. Smallpox in San Francisco in the late 1800s was blamed on the Chinese as disease vectors. Chinese were used as human test subjects for a vaccine that was not fully developed through forced vaccinations. San Francisco Chinatown in the early 1900s was put under forced quarantine during an epidemic of bubonic plague. And we're all familiar with the more recent SARS virus, where all Chinese were stigmatized as SARS carriers. But ascribing a disease to one country is not only repugnant, it is a failure as a containment strategy. This is a global pandemic requiring a global response. As we know, pandemics have no ethnicity, and the virus seeks human hosts and does not differentiate based upon national origin. The virus is now everywhere, and so is the racism that accompanies this virus. COVID-19 has been used not just to advance anti-Chinese sentiments, but political parties and groups in the US, UK, France, Italy, Spain, Germany have used COVID-19 to advance more broadly anti-immigrant sentiments. Italy's former interior minister, far-right politician Matteo Salvini, traced his country's outbreak without justification to the docking of a rescue ship with 276 migrants from Africa in Sicily. And Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared, quote, "Our experience is that foreigners brought in the disease and that it is spreading among foreigners." And COVID-19 is also being used to advance crudely racist sentiments on social media. Just to show you a couple of these, this one with a photo which is to me reminiscent of Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, white womanhood, white fragility, and below the threatening hordes here, Latinx swarming a fence and consuming hospital resources. Or we could look at this one, which is an injunctive where to turn your frustration about shelter in place, coupling anti-immigrant sentiment with white pride, blaming COVID on open borders. So turning to borders and travel restriction. In March, President Trump tweeted, "This is why we need borders." He did not name what this is, but it's obvious this is the coronavirus. In the words of authors from the Migration Policy Institute, governments around the world have been dipping into the migration management toolbox to demonstrate decisive action in the face of a global pandemic. Or to rephrase this, governments around the world have used the global pandemic to decisively act against migration, with public health constituting a pretext for a crackdown. More than 130 countries have implemented border closures, travel restrictions, prohibitions on arrivals from certain areas, and heightened screening. These steps initially were taken to try to block COVID-19 from crossing borders, and later were part of a raft of mobility restrictions seeking to mitigate further spread. These restrictions failed in their initial goal of preventing the breakout from seeping across international borders. Travel bans are a very blunt tool to try to stem spread. Applying border controls to the spread of disease across international boundaries is, quote, like trying to catch water with a sieve. As we've seen in the United States, when unaccompanied by a testing regime, contact tracing, social distancing, travel bans are ineffective to contain the virus. But if you look at the world, over 90% of the world is living in a country with COVID-19 travel restrictions on persons who are not citizens nor residents. Focusing on the United States in terms of what has happened, in January, as President Trump said very early, he banned entry of all travelers from the People's Republic of China into the United States. Subsequently, in February, travelers from Iran. In March, he announced restrictions on travel from more than 24 European countries, which form the Schengen area of Europe, and then added the UK and the Republic of Ireland a few days later. You may note or remember this confusion and panic that took place in mid-March when it was unclear who the European travel ban applied to. Trump had given an Oval Office address where he basically stated, "We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. People were very confused as to whether this impacted US citizens, lawful permanent residents to the United States, And there was a mad panic dash where people spent thousands of dollars on plane tickets, were funneled to a very small number of airports, kept in line waiting for customs in close quarters and confined spaces, apparently waiting to be asked if they had a fever, and then given a list of numbers to call with no other kind of contact tracing or information. So this policy, which was intended to block the pathogen's entry into the United States, instead delivered a viral infusion into the United States here from Europe. What else has happened in terms of travel restrictions from the United States? In mid-March, the United States and Canada closed the border between the two countries, not impacting what's called essential travel, meaning returning US citizens and lawful residents, students, workers, people seeking medical care, and then freight haulers engaged in trade were still allowed to pass. A similar agreement was made 2 days later between the US and Mexico on March 20th. In April, President Trump signed a proclamation suspending the entry of immigrants who present a risk to the US labor market, about which I will say more. And then in May, he issued a proclamation suspending travel into the US from any person who had been in Brazil. So to explain this April 22nd proclamation, and actually, but before I do that, a little bit about the US-Canada, US-Mexico border closures. Basically, they were issued first as 30-day periods. Now it's indicated that the travel restrictions will exist until late July. And in particular, the border closure between the US and Mexico has dramatically impacted the ability of persons seeking asylum in the United States to enter, as I will explain more in a little bit. But returning to the question of the suspension of immigration. So Trump tweeted April 20th this interesting tweet. In light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens, I will be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States. When this tweet came across the transom, it sounded like all immigration was going to be shut down. What actually happened was something less than that, still very dramatic, as I will explain. But here are the details of this. So it's a presidential proclamation. In particular, it's a 60-day suspension of entry into the United States of certain categories of immigrants. The call of this proclamation is that the purpose of this is to slow the spread of COVID-19 and preserve jobs for American workers. But let's look and see actually who the proclamation impacted. Before we do that, I think I need to explain a little bit more about how the US legal admissions system is set up for immigrants. So let me show you a few slides about that. So basically, when we look at lawful admission of non-citizens into the United States, there's a division of categories between what are called immigrants and non-immigrants. So immigrants refers to colloquially people who have what used to be a green card. It's been various colors, but that's the term that has stuck. Another term for this are lawful permanent residents or legal permanent residents. So these are persons who are enabled, if they are past the hoops to be shown that they deserve to be LPRs, can permanently become members of US society. To be naturalized as a US citizen, a requisite first stepping stone is for somebody to first have a certain number of years as a lawful permanent resident. Within the category of immigrant, there are different ways in which one can actually access this benefit. You can become an immigrant because you have close proximate family members who are either US citizens or lawful permanent residents who are sponsoring you for purposes of family reunification. They're employment-based or skill-based reasons that one can actually get a green card to come to the US. There's this really fascinating category of what's called the diversity visa, which seeks to basically reverse in terms of where people had come from in the first two categories of family sponsored and employment based, to diversify the sending stream so that countries that send a lot of people as family sponsored or employment based immigrants are actually ineligible to participate in the diversity visa. But people fill out basically a form electronically, and there's a mass lottery where millions of people apply for about 50,000 spots per year to get visas. And then refugees also could be understood as another category of immigrants. I'm thinking here of, in particular, of overseas refugees, but I'll say more about that later because it's a slightly different way that people are able to access permanent residency. On the other side of the slide, you see what are called non-immigrants. So that's a technical term referring to people who are non-citizens who come to the United States for a limited period of time for a specific purpose. And they're known by the visa category, which is a letter in the Immigration and Nationality Act. So you might think of, for example, most famously, the H-1B visa holder, which is the highly skilled person coming for purposes of work, tourists, as you can see here, business visitors, students, au pairs. There are a myriad category of different kinds of bases on which persons can come to the United States as non-immigrants. Okay, so if we go back to the immigrants category, there's an extremely complicated formula that governs how many persons can come in as immigrants into the United States per year. Again, these are green card holders. And there's simultaneously 3 different kinds of limits or quotas that are operating. One of them is a cap on how many persons can be admitted as immigrants per year, with an important exception, which you see in the aqua bar. So within that, the big category I want to tell you about is something called immediate relatives, which refers to people who are parents, spouses, or children of US citizens. Those are called immediate relatives, and they're not subject to these numerical caps. There are also per country limits. So basically when the United States abolished their national origins quotas, which were the explicitly racially discriminatory system that admitted immigrants from the 1920s to 1965, they decided to do something that seemed formally equal, of giving every country in the world the same per country quota. Now you might say that doesn't actually seem fair in outcome or substance. Some countries have much bigger populations. Some countries have contiguous borders with the United States. Some countries have different histories with the United States, but that equal per country quota is the system that we currently have. There are also quotas within the preference categories. So if you, for example, if you see here within the family sponsored category, there's separate preferences which refer to the kinds of relationships that the would-be immigrant has with either the sponsoring US citizen or the lawful permanent resident. And each of these has a numerical cap. And the reason that there are these caps, that fact is part of why, you may have heard that people are waiting sometimes for decades, for their slot to come up. Okay, so how does this all relate to what Trump did in April? Here we go. So the COVID-19 immigration ban, which was this proclamation issued in April, basically said that certain immigrants are not going to be issued a visa for a period of 60 days. There's a quote unquote temporary pause on this. And if you look at who is directly impacted and who is not, what you see here is a really fascinating pattern of priority in terms of which immigrants the United States thinks are most desirable to the nation or most difficult to turn away, and which are more expediently rejected, okay? So when you look at who's directly impacted and who's not, you can see that spouses and children, so children is a technical term in the Immigration and Nationality Act where you're unmarried and under 21, children and spouses of US citizens can still get a visa and come into the United States, whereas parents of US citizens who have to be over the age of 21 to sponsor their parents. Parents are expendable, right? Brothers and sisters of US citizens or adult children of US citizens are also categories which are affected by this ban. Spouses and children of lawful permanent residents are also affected by this ban, right? So if you think about who's at the center of membership, that's the US citizen. The lawful permanent resident has less of a claim on who they can sponsor as relatives, and their spouses, their children are actually also subject to this immigration ban. Diversity visa lottery winners are also subject to this ban, right? Non-citizens who seek to enter on employment-based visas are also subject to this ban. However, you can see it says unless specifically exempted, and if you look at the right-hand part of the category, the third line, non-citizens who seek to enter the US as immigrant investors can still come in. That's a really interesting category under employment-based immigrants, where if you invest $1 million in the United States, you can essentially buy a green card. So what does this mean numerically in terms of the impact of this suspension? What you could see here are the status quo, right? Before the issuance of the COVID-19 travel suspension, indicated in blue. And then the red bar is the number of persons estimated who would basically at this point no longer be able to get a green card to come into the United States. And so you can see the particular categories that are most impacted here. One way to think about this is an attempt to implement dramatic changes to our system of family-based immigration. Why do I say that? Most employment-based green card applicants are already in the United States. They apply for green cards through a process called adjustment, which means that they are already here in the United States on temporary non-immigrant visas, for example, as H-1B visas, and they adjust their status to getting a green card. And this specific travel suspension only applies to people who are not already in the United States, okay? So the real numerical impact here is on persons trying to come in as family members. If you actually look at the categories that are most impacted, it's somewhat similar or very similar to the RAISE Act, which was co-sponsored by Tom Cotton, the Republican of Arkansas, who was recently in the news because of his op-ed in the New York Times calling for the use of active duty military forces against protesters. So the RAISE Act was basically dead on arrival in Congress, but it would have accomplished similar goals in terms of the categories to cut. This travel suspension is even more restrictive than the RAISE Act because it blocks lawful permanent residents from bringing their spouses and children, which the RAISE Act did not do. Notice also that this travel suspension is characterized as a pause, right? This is the brainchild of Stephen Miller. Miller told various persons at various meetings that his intention is for this to go on indefinitely, right? So we can expect that this will be extended at the end of 60 days. The estimate is that this would cut immigration by 33% by suspending most applications for permanent residence filed from abroad. The estimate is, if this lasts for 1 year, is that 358,000 of the 1.1 million green cards that the US typically issues per year would not be approved so long as this proclamation is in effect. There was an unsuccessful attempt to get a TRO from a US district court in Oregon. The judge basically said, yes, there is hardship here, but this is for Congress to fix, not for the courts. So how did the administration do this? Well, they relied on this section of the Immigration and Nationality Act, 212F, which had been used for the past 4 decades by various presidents for various very limited programs, and then became much better known because it is the basis used by President Trump in his different iterations of what is known as the Muslim ban, which was challenged in Trump versus Hawaii, ultimately upheld in its third iteration, indicating that 212F is extremely broad. It gives the president broad deference to prevent certain categories of individuals from entering the United States if their entry is detrimental to the interests of the US. Note that when you look at the presidential proclamation, this travel suspension also relies on a different section, section 215A of the INA, which basically says if the Surgeon General thinks there's communicable disease in a foreign country, suspension of the right to introduce such persons is required in the interest of public health. The Surgeon General and the President can prohibit the introduction of such persons and property. So apparently, the New York Times indicated Stephen Miller had been scouring the INA, had long wanted to use this particular section to bar persons from coming into the United States. So even though the impact of this travel suspension of immigrants is very severe, right? There's so many people whose lives have been absolutely upended by this. Some people were very upset by this because they felt it didn't go far enough. And these were conservatives who expected a, quote, total ban on immigration would not just be a brief delay, a suspension in green cards for immigrants, but that would include a ban on persons who were coming into the United States as non-immigrants who were here on temporary work visas. This is why at the very end of my presentation, when I say what might we see upcoming, it is expected that Trump is going to actually issue another order this week, creating a similar kind of suspension for immigrant workers who are here as temporary visa holders. So far, this has not happened because of concern about the impact, for example, on the food supply and the staffing of other industries. An excellent op-ed I would recommend to you, written by Jennifer Chacon and Erwin Chemerinsky, appeared in the New York Times about this particular suspension of visas for immigrants, which I have linked to here. So when you think about borders, we of course also have the question of the border wall. We can see here that the administration is continuing to focus on this question of the construction of a border wall, with the logic being that the construction will actually prevent and slow down the introduction of the virus from outside US borders. This logic is problematic in a number of ways. As of last week, the Mexican state of Sonora had reported 1,303 cases per 1 million people of COVID-19. Across the border, Arizona had reported 5,506 cases per million. Similarly, San Diego has 3 times as many cases of COVID-19 as Tijuana does, right? So many Mexicans actually worry that the virus is crossing the border from the US into Mexico, not the other way around. And as early as March, Mexicans were demanding that their government crack down on Americans crossing the border. Secondly, border wall construction is actually dangerous, right? They're construction workers who are traveling to the area of the border from other states. The work is conducted in remote towns with limited medical facilities, right? Third, a structural barrier is useless to fight the spread of disease. And fourth, notice where this picture is, right? This is Organ Pipe National Park, designated by UNESCO as an internationally protected biosphere reserve. The border wall is being constructed on land of the Tohono O'odham Nation, who live on both sides of the border. The construction is actually using explosives to blast ancient burial sites. It's siphoning an aquifer that feeds a desert oasis where human beings have slaked their thirst for 16,000 years. So to do this, the Trump administration has waived dozens of laws, including measures protecting endangered species and Native American burial sites. So that's what's going on with the border wall. Okay, let me turn to the question of refugees. So refugees are among the world's most vulnerable people. There are about 2.5 million refugees living in camps, which are often in remote areas with very limited health care, very high population density, lack of access to sanitation and water. There's a lot of concern about COVID attacking refugees. I could show you an image that was sent to me by somebody in Sweden. To understand this image of COVID basically pursuing this running family wearing masks, one would need to know that in the European context, the symbol of the running family is actually used most frequently with the terms welcome refugees. They're considered to symbolize refugees. This is something that became very popular in 2016 with the mass migration of refugees to Europe. Whereas in the US, we know this image very differently as on a traffic sign where it is thought to actually, or it's known to symbolize undocumented immigrants, right? And so I actually wrote this piece called Refugees Welcome, published in the Berkeley La Raza Law Journal, trying to parse through how did the sign come to have such different, this image come to have such different meanings in the US context and the European context. But to think about what's going on with COVID and refugees, one thing to know is that the United States has two different means through which it admits persons who seek refuge. One is our overseas refugee program, where every year the president decides how many persons can be allocated visas to be admitted. People are vetted overseas before they actually come in, and then they get relocated through refugee relocation. So this is the overseas refugee program. You can see here that under President Trump, there has been a dramatic limitation already pre-COVID of how many people could come in. Trump had allocated for the fiscal year 2020, only 18,000 persons could be given refugee visas in 2020. There's also another means of admitting people who are seeking refuge, which is people come physically to the United States on their own, right? They're not already designated as overseas refugees. These are known as onshore asylees. These are people seeking asylum. And they can be doing this request when they're first showing up at the US border, or maybe they came already to the United States, for example, as a student or a tourist, and then they request asylum. This request for asylum is something that can be made affirmatively, where the non-citizen, the would-be asylee, identifies themselves to the United States and says, I want asylum, and then they go through a hearing with an asylum officer. Or it is a request that can be made defensively when the immigrant is already in removal proceedings and then raises asylum as a form of relief. Okay, and so that defensive asylum is something that can happen at the border or can happen in the interior. So one thing just to show you, when you look at these numbers, these are not huge numbers of people coming, either in the overseas refugee program or as onshore asylees. These are tiny numbers of people given the number of, the capacity that exists in the United States. So turning specifically to the question of how COVID has impacted this, basically the Trump administration before COVID had already started limiting access to US immigration courts and the asylum system in response to the attempt by Central American families and children in 2018 and 2019 who claimed a fear of harm if they were sent home, right? So people coming from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in particular also Mexico. So the United States basically created a program called Migrant Protection Protocols, requiring applicants to wait outside US territory until their claims were adjudicated. And they returned more than 60,000 asylum seekers across the border last year. These hearings for Migrant Protection Protocol have been suspended during the COVID outbreak. Homeland Security officials also started shipping asylum seekers from Honduras and El Salvador to Guatemala last year, directing them to apply for protection in Guatemala rather than in the United States. So basically, these programs preserved a very limited degree of access to US immigration courts for migrants with the strongest and most serious claims. Essentially, the emergency measures now at the border have cut these pathways off, okay? So you could see here, since March 21st, this public health emergency has been used by Customs and Border Patrol to turn back more than 10,000 people from border entry points. This is something that's basically returned people to potentially life-threatening conditions. It's impacting both adults and minors. Historically, what has happened before this emergency period is somebody shows up at the border, they're allowed to go through what's called a credible fear screening. If they're able to show that they credibly fear their life or freedom would be threatened, if they pass that screening, they then get put in removal hearings or removal proceedings and are able to present their case before an immigration judge, right? In practice now, that's not happening, and instead, the only kinds of claims that are being entertained are under the Convention Against Torture, and you can see here numerically, USCIS screened only 59 cases over this almost 2-month period in March to May and rejected 54 of them, allowing just 2 people to stay within the United States. This is something also that's very much impacting minors, unaccompanied minors. With a recent victory just 2 weeks ago, where a judge reviewing the case of a 16-year-old Honduran boy in the first legal challenge to the administration's border closure policy in reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, basically temporarily halted his deportation until a full hearing can be scheduled. Okay. Moving quickly to the question of enforcement. So what does enforcement look like during the pandemic? Basically on March 18th, US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, said they would temporarily adjust enforcement posture, focusing on public safety risks and people who would be subject to criminal grounds of removal. It's important to know here that this is in a broader context where the Obama administration had created particular priorities in terms of enforcement that the Trump administration had removed. Essentially, once the Trump administration, once Trump came into office, they announced that anybody was fair game, anybody, any non-citizen is a priority for enforcement, and there was to be no prioritization, which is part of what created this incredible climate of fear once he took office. The number of people deported under Trump actually has been dwarfed by how many were deported during the highest year of deportations during Obama's administration, which was 432,281 in 2013. The latest figures are for 2018, where deportations under Trump reached 337,287. But again, what's different is who is being deported under Trump, right? So the number of deportations of people that don't have criminal convictions increased to 43% of all deportations. Notice also, it's important to underline, what are these criminal convictions? The vast majority of immigrants arrested on federal charges in 2018 were accused of immigration crimes as their federal criminal offenses. In other words, illegal entry, illegal reentry. Okay, so when people refer to criminal aliens, they're often referring to this kind of category of persons, which once you start breaking it down, start to actually recognize what is the criminality at issue. Is the criminality merely the question of breaking immigration law or not? So can people go get medical attention without fear? Can they get the coronavirus test? The answer is yes. There's a sensitive location policy where medical treatment, medical health facilities are on the list of places where ICE is actually not supposed to conduct enforcement. You can see that there is a drop in apprehensions by ICE since March. Okay, detention. There are thousands of people who are detained in immigration facilities nationwide. And unlike people outside, people in immigration detention cannot socially distance. They are locked up with hundreds of other people. They have limited access to soap. They often must pay for hand sanitizer. Face masks are difficult to obtain or not distributed. And the practice of routine transfer from one facility to another exacerbates the spread of the virus. The large-scale release of immigrant detainees is an urgent priority. The system is notorious for its privatization, its lack of meaningful oversight, its perverse financial incentives. So immigration detention is part of the mass incarceration system. It's part of the serious conversation that is suddenly front and center about over-policing and about prison abolition. Note that many people in immigration detention, many only spend brief periods in detention. People who have cases pending can face a much longer period of confinement, which can be months. Now, who is detained? Well, basically, people are detained while they await a determination of their immigration status or their potential removal. There are over 200 immigration detention centers in the US. On average, over 350,000 people are detained in the system per year. Most people detained in ICE custody, again, have no criminal record. 4 out of 5 have no record or committed only a minor offense, such as a traffic violation. For those with criminal convictions, the most frequent crime is illegal entry. And I say all this because the backdrop of this is the assumption that prisons, right, are for people who have committed crimes, even while that basic equation is something that also is being questioned through the critique of mass incarceration, critical resistance, and abolition. I'm not sure I have time to show this to you. This is just like a really creative video protest where women who were being detained in South Louisiana actually used video visitation to hold up signs to explain their concern that one of their fellow detainees actually had COVID. But let me show you this. Can you guys see this map? Whitney, do you see
No,
it?
we
No?
can't.
Okay.
You have to shift what part of your screen you're sharing.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
How's that?
Got it.
Okay. Here's one illustration of where immigration detention centers are, where there are COVID-19 reports, right? So you could see there's specific information about different facilities and what some of the issues are. Let me also show you this incredible spreadsheet that Professor Sharon Dolovich has created. If you could see this, this is basically enumerating very specifically, very updated where all the cases of COVID are. And when you look at the spreadsheet, you could see that the highest numbers are at Otay Mesa, which is near San Diego, and Eloy, which is in Arizona. So there's a lot of concern about the spread of COVID-19 and immigration detention. When you look at the testing and the numbers, you could see this rapid escalation between mid-March and mid-June in terms of the numbers of people who are testing positive for COVID-19. And if you look at the bottom of the text, when you look at the percentage of people who were tested positive, 51% or 28%, right? Just for comparison, the World Health Organization says that rates of positivity and testing should be 5% or lower for at least 14 days before reopening any kind of facility, right? So there's litigation to challenge this detention. There are dozens of lawsuits that have been filed. ICE has released over 900 higher risk detainees using its parole power. And then there also have been court cases where people are filing writs of habeas corpus saying that this is a violation of the substantive due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, and over 190 detainees have been released as a result of these court orders. So again, here we see civil detainees' constitutional rights being violated if a condition of confinement places one at substantial risk of suffering serious harm, such as the harm caused by a pandemic. This is, I think, a Judge Terry Hatcher case, and you can see here again, this is in tandem with what's going on in the prison population and trying to get people out. Many are demanding that ICE temporarily suspend civil immigration enforcement and release those in detention for the duration of the pandemic, but this has not happened. You could see just a quick comparison, the US versus Canada. Canada basically has released more than half of people in custody versus a much more modest release program in the United States. Some of the people being detained in the United States, of course, are children, right? So either children who are unaccompanied minors or children who are being held in custody with their parents. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Berkeley alums. I was so excited to see this. These are, if you can see this, these are, oops, the video, okay. Two of these are my former students who were able to, under the Flores Agreement, get children from federal immigration custody released. Okay. So a few quick words about deportation. You could see here the New York Times asking, why is the US exporting coronavirus? Just as the US has exported gang violence through deportation, now it is exporting COVID. And just to show you some statistics here, you could see Guatemala's government reporting that nearly 1/5 of the country's COVID cases are linked to deportees from the US. And just shocking statistics here. Haiti, at least 3 deportees testing positive in a country that only has 200 beds available for COVID-19 patients. Naturalization delays, another topic. Basically, there's a huge problem of massive delays in naturalization because of social distancing, and now the issue where one is supposed to take the oath in person to naturalize. This is something that absolutely seems to be impacting the size of the electorate for the November election, right? And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people potentially unable to naturalize in time to vote. There's pending litigation about this, taking the oath in person, that's coming out of Philadelphia, which is what this slide is here. Access to support funds. So Congress passed the CARES Act, right, to provide funds to try to assist people to compensate for the economic, horrific economic conditions that people are facing. Unfortunately, the way the CARES Act is written is that it only allows persons to receive a stimulus check if they have a social security number. There are many non-citizens who are undocumented, who pay federal taxes, who use a taxpayer identification number and not a social security number, who are unable to actually get a stimulus check. This also includes people who filed taxes jointly with someone who does not have a social security number. In other words, people who are US citizens who are married to persons who don't have social security numbers are also not entitled to get a CARES Act stimulus check. So immigrants and their families have been left out of this. And there's litigation currently by MALDEF saying that this violates the fundamental right to marry. California has tried to step into the breach with separate funds to provide taxpayer-funded assistance. It's a $75 million cash assistance program that philanthropists and private donors have pledged to add another $50 million to. The estimate is that this will support only in total about 250,000 undocumented immigrants each receiving $500 in direct assistance or up to $1,000 per household. There are an estimated 2 million undocumented immigrants who live in California, more than in any other state. They are particularly vulnerable to the economic shock caused by the pandemic because they tend to work in jobs that have disappeared, as cooks, as servers, as hotel workers, as domestic help. 2/3 of them have lived in the US for more than a decade. Collectively, they have 5 million American-born children. They pay billions of dollars in taxes. These are of all the undocumented immigrants, not just the ones in California. But most states have not moved to provide this kind of assistance. Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts are starting programs. New York City, Austin, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma have city-funded or private initiatives. Future changes, this is what I'm going to close with before we go to our discussion. So this is what people think, this is from the paper yesterday, this is what people will think may happen this week, which would be another executive order to suspend new visas for people coming as non-immigrants, people coming for specific purposes, for temporary periods of time to work on H-1B visas, skilled workers, H-2B visas. These are people who are often seasonal workers, as it says here, landscaping, hospitality. L1s, executives transferred within a company, and J1s, right? That's au pairs. That's actually also Fulbright fellows. When you think about who comes to the US as scholars, typically they're here on F student visas or J visas. The exemption here might be for agriculture and healthcare, right? And so we will see if this is what is coming next down the pike. Okay, I'm gonna stop share now and go where I can see everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Volpp. So I do have one question waiting, and while I read that, if you have a question for the professor, you can raise your hand or send me something in the chat. So it strikes me that many of the executive acts you described to restrict immigration are based in delegations of authority to the president, either generally or in the public health context specifically. I'm wondering if you think that the amount of discretion and delegated authority Congress seems to have given the president in the immigration context needs to be fundamentally rethought, or if the problem is not the amount of delegation and executive discretion, but rather the particular exercise of it by Trump, especially in the context of COVID as a cover to achieve broader restrictionist goals. Is this the moment for Congress to remove that delegated authority and more rigidly bind future presidents and administrative agencies?
What a great and interesting question. So I would say what you're thinking about in particular is the section 212F. And maybe, I won't go back to the slide right now to remind people, but it's not just COVID under the cover of the pandemic that led to Trump using this. It was actually predating this. This was what he used in his iterations of what's known as the travel ban, the refugee or the Muslim ban, right? These executive orders that went through 3 different iterations to try to keep out persons from initially 7 and 6 and more countries, which initially all had predominantly Muslim populations, right? And it is written into the INA that the president has this authority. It is the case that predating Trump, when you look, for example, at the Congressional Research Service has this really helpful analysis of all kinds of things. And they have a compendium of every single time that 212F has been used by a previous president. And they are much more modest uses of this program, although I will say that it was used, I think it was President Reagan who used it in terms of trying to keep Haitians on the high seas from entering the United States, right? But they had been very limited programs. You know, so one question is whether 212F is something that should be somehow struck from the INA. It's, in general, the problem, I think, is with what is referred to as the plenary power in immigration law. So I started talking a little bit about this with that first case, Che Chan-ping. There are basically three foundational Supreme Court cases from the late 1800s, early 1900s, which created the framework for contemporary immigration law and its constitutional parameters, and what can the executive do, what can Congress do. Does the judiciary have any role to review? How rigorously can they review what the political branches, the executive and Congress, do in the realm of immigration? And all three of these cases were in the context of, as we saw from this early history, this kind of despised community of Asian immigrants, right, at the late 1800s, early 1900s. And what they say first in the context of exclusion and later extending it to deportation is that Congress and then the executive have this authority to regulate immigration, and the judiciary essentially has to take a back seat, right? There's only a very limited role for review. And particularly when the rationale for Congress or the executive to act is national security, right? The judiciary is very much hands-off. Right, and that's essentially what we saw in the context of Trump versus Hawaii. I am sure that Dean Chemerinsky has something to say on this. Let me just quickly then, but also just say that if you're interested in knowing more about the role of the executive in the context of immigration, Adam Cox at NYU, Christina Rodriguez at Yale wrote two really helpful law review articles, I think in 2009 and 2013, on the president and immigration and the president and immigration, or the executive and immigration redux, where they basically hammer out, well, what exactly are the parameters for the executive to act in the context of immigration? What have the limitations been historically? How has it been interpreted? And then what is the situation that we see now? So.
Dean Chemerinsky, did you have a question?
Leti, there's a wonderful presentation in response to the comment you just made a moment ago. Last year, the conservatives in the court indicated a desire to revisit the non-delegation doctrine. A very strong opinion by Gorsuch that was joined by Roberts and Thomas. Alito concurred in the judgment, but then Kavanaugh, in a separate opinion, once he joined the court, said that he would like to revisit the non-delegation doctrine. There may very well be 5 votes to revisit the non-delegation doctrine and very much limit the ability to delegate to the president in the future, which could play out in immigration like in all areas. The quick question that I was going to ask you is, assume that Joe Biden wins the presidency. How quickly can the new president change the kinds of policies that you adopted? Would it have to go through notice and comment rulemaking? Could he do it on January 20th? I think of this also in the context, if Trump issues another executive order to rescind DACA, could Biden immediately rescind that?
So I guess, first of all, I would maybe want to emphasize, okay, yeah, so if DACA is so essential, DACA is also this kind of stopgap, as we well know, right? And so the hope is that if Biden is elected and the Congress changes its composition, that there may be so-called comprehensive immigration reform or legalization for people who are currently DACA recipients, or people who actually are not currently DACA recipients, who don't qualify for DACA, but should be qualifying for legalization with a more broad understanding in terms of age caps and dates in which people arrived and how long they've been here, et cetera. I would, I mean, as you know, the whole question is, it was sort of this shock when DAPA was attacked in the courts, and the argument was, oh, you didn't follow notice and comment rulemaking. I mean, it was really something out of left field that people didn't anticipate would be the reason for this to be attacked. But the need for notice and comment rulemaking was predicated on the assumption that this is a mandatory rule and not a discretionary program, right? So the persons who have attacked DAPA and now DACA, saying that this is illegal. First of all, it's creating this legalization program. It's not creating a legalization program. People who have DACA have not had their legal status changed. They're still undocumented. All they have is prosecutorial discretion, which enables them not to be removed for a certain period of time on a renewable and revocable discretionary at this point 2-year period. And then because of underlying regulations, they also are able to get work authorization. It does not create a legalization program. It's not the president actually enacting a law that's saying I'm legalizing these people, right? But a second inaccurate presumption that was operating in the Fifth Circuit and by those who are attacking DAPA and now DACA is that basically, when people apply, it's a rubber stamp application and there's no meaningful review of any of the applications, which is actually not the case. And so one of the things that happened with DAPA is they looked at DACA approvals and said, oh, well, they're so high. It seems like there's no meaningful review of these individuals. This is a mandatory rule program, which should have been subject to notice and comment. But in fact, it's not. There are people that are actually denied DACA, right? So as long as it's a program that is one where there's discretion operating, maybe there would not need to be notice and comment, but I would think that because many people seem to be persuaded that it's one that is a mandatory rule, that perhaps there would be. So I don't know. I would also say that, I mean, I think it's really important for people to remember that there had been discretionary enforcement all the time in the immigration system. Any system of enforcement involves discretion, right? You cannot, if you think about, for example, I always use this example, and now I long for this example because we can't do this, but if you would stand in front of a law school on Bancroft and you're surrounded by people, and there are people that are jaywalking, and there's like a police car sitting there. The police car is not going to stop and arrest the people that are jaywalking because they have other priorities, right? A system of enforcement cannot function without discretion and prioritization, right? So DACA and then DAPA, which would have created a similar temporary reprieve from deportation for the parents of US citizens and lawful permanent residents, but never was actually able to be put into place because of this litigation. DACA and DAPA is a similar kind of prioritization of enforcement in a way that absolutely accords with our sense of what is the rule of law and transparency, right? Instead of having this happen in individual cases behind closed doors, just benefiting people who knew about it, right? This is something where it says affirmatively apply, right? So it's truly tragic to me that it's been subject to so much dissensus. I'm thrilled and shocked that the Supreme Court came out the way it did earlier this week. I am relieved that I think it's unlikely that Trump could do anything meaningful to get rid of DACA in the number of months before November. But you've been so intimately connected with all of this, Dean Chemerinsky, you may have other things you want to say about this.
I think I'll just say thank you so much for doing this wonderful presentation, and I'm sure everyone learned so much from it. I know it was a huge amount of time for you to prepare it, and just very grateful to you for doing it.
Well, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see everybody here, and I hope that we can all meet in person, in the near future. So,
yes.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.